Hello friends, it is Sam from DIY Huntress and I am so stoked about today's video because in today's project I'm going to show you how I transformed a back room in my parents' home into a drop zone with this custom mudroom built in, as well as a home office space for my dad. I am so excited about this project, so let's get started. Before we jump on into this video, I just want to give a huge thank you to my friends at the Home Depot for sponsoring this room renovation for my parents. So let's start at the beginning. This back room of my parents' home is the back entrance of their home, and if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that it's just been a hot mess. It was supposed to be my dad's office, but it's also supposed to be a pseudo mudroom, and it's just been like pretty chaotic back here. Now, if you've been hanging around my channel, then you will remember about a month ago, my brothers and I completely cleared out one corner of this room and I built a custom desk for my dad so that he could have a spot to work from when he's working from home. And if you want all of the details on that project, as well as that custom build, you can check out that video on my channel. I have linked it below this video for you to watch. That being said, now that this corner is pretty much almost complete, it's time to start focusing on the rest of the room and to start to make this feel like a cohesive space in my parents' home. Hi. So, last time I was in this room back here, it was to build that guy there. And even though it's kind of set up as a home office space right now, it's not fully done. I kind of just wanted to wait until the rest of the room was completely finished to tackle that. However, while I was over there figuring out this desk situation, my awesome parents were over here figuring out that desk situation. So if you remember from, I don't know how long ago in the video, like a couple minutes ago, there was a desk here with a ton of stuff. Well, my parents have officially cleared all of that out. So essentially what we're looking at is the desk and office space is staying there, and then on this wall I'm gonna do some sort of mudroom built-in situation. I've drafted up some ideas. Before I get ahead of myself, I still have to clear out the rest of this room. There's still stuff that needs to go. Agenda today, clear the stuff out of the rest of this room, smack some paint on these walls. I wish it was that easy. And then we will start, I guess, building this mudroom situation tomorrow. So let's go paint. Now, while you enjoyed this little montage of me cleaning up the rest of this space, let me walk you through some of the ideas that I have floating around in my head. Essentially, as I mentioned in that video, I do want to create some mudroom storage options for this back room because it does tend to gather a lot of shoes and coats. And I also want to add some more storage solutions to the space that allow my parents to still use this as a functioning office for my dad and to store some little things here and there. So cabinets and bookshelves are a must. I feel like there's not enough coffee in the tri-state area to prepare me mentally for painting this room. Luckily, my parents actually did the ceiling a little over a year ago, so I don't have to paint the ceiling. Silver linings, but I really want to get started on this mudroom built-in. I'm so excited about it. My mom actually liked the design that I came up with, and I can't get started on that until this room is painted, so wish me luck. Before I could actually get started painting, there was a ton of prep work I needed to do. First, I needed to remove any of the drywall anchors from the drywall. I like to use a little trick where you screw a screw into the anchor about halfway and then pull the entire anchor out of the wall with that same screw. And then once you have a hole there, it gets patched on up. I allowed all these patches to dry and then I sanded everything nice and flat and wiped down all of the walls before even thinking about getting started painting. I also covered the floors because they are beautiful and I don't want to ruin them, and I'm not redoing them because they were just redone a few years ago. But once all of that prep work was done, it was then time to start painting. Now, a question that I get a lot whenever I paint rooms is how do you calculate how much paint you need for the project? And luckily, Home Depot has this awesome project calculator on their app that allows you to calculate exactly how much paint you need so that you don't buy too much or too little. So I just plugged in all of the dimensions for this room into that project calculator, and it told me that I only needed 1 gallon of paint, which is awesome because by default I usually purchase 2, and then it's hard to find a place to recycle that paint once I'm done with it. So honestly, so grateful for that app. And I actually ended up going with this like really pretty greige color. My mom is a huge fan of the greiges. That was a combination paint and primer, but if you're looking for the exact color that I used, as well as any of the materials or tools I used for this project, I've linked them all below this video in the video description, as well as on my website. Also, side note, can we talk about the fact that it's already been 2 years since I built this barn door for this back room? It is holding up so beautifully. I'm so stoked on it. But anyway, after 2 coats of paint and a happy dance, I was finally done painting this room. I allowed it to dry for a couple of days, and then it was time to start measuring out the build for this mudroom area of the back room, which was honestly my favorite part of this entire project. Here's the thing, however, my parents' house is 90 years old, so it was really important to take as many measurements as possible before getting started. Super official measurements. After grabbing all of my measurements for the build, I was able to then pick up the plywood that I needed, and a lot of this build was actually completed either on afternoons or weekends in between my full-time job. So I did end up ordering some birch plywood online at Home Depot and then picking it up in store before bringing it back to my workshop and then getting started on the build. For this build, I used my table saw and my miter saw to make all of the cuts. If you don't have a table saw or miter saw in your workshop and you want to make a build like this one, it can definitely also be done using a circular saw. I'm smack in the middle of a workshop renovation right now, so I did not have the floor space to make this work with the circular saw at the current moment, so the miter saw and the table saw worked just fine. In terms of how I laid out this build, I basically broke it down into 2 or 3 different parts. I had to make a cabinet, I had to make cubbies, and then eventually, you'll see in a little bit, I also had to make a floating bench. So I ended up making the cabinets and the cubbies out of birch plywood, and I used some edge banding that I ironed onto all of the edges and then trimmed to make the birch plywood look like solid wood. I then pre-sanded all of my pieces before assembling anything together. That way I didn't have to sand it once it was assembled. It's way easier to just sand everything first. After sanding, which is unsurprisingly my least favorite part of any project, I then began to assemble the cubby system first. I added the end pieces using pocket hole screws and wood glue because they're going to be hidden anyway by the cabinet and by the wall. And then for those middle sections, I used pocket hole screws on the bottom portions of the dividers and then screwed them directly into the wood from the top of the cabinet because the top of the cabinet's going to be hidden by the ceiling. Now, okay, in full disclosure, if I were to ever build this locker cubby system thing again, which I'm not really sure when I'm ever going to have an opportunity to do that, but anyway, I probably would have planned this out a little differently and sourced the baskets that I wanted to use for this first before building, because instead I ended up building this cubby system and then found that it was super difficult to find baskets that would fit that were also budget friendly. I definitely had to get creative with this locker system because the kitchen entrance is super close to the mudroom, which means that the mudroom could only be about a foot deep, and that made finding like skinnier baskets just a little more difficult. Wow, I'm clearly harboring some deep resentment for baskets right now, so we're going to move on past that and instead talk about how I attached these to the wall, because I ended up having to add some supports to the back of this cubby that are going to be drilled through and into the studs on that back wall. Now, I did not close up these cubbies completely because the back wall that I'm hanging these on also has a piping system in it, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to miss a stud and accidentally drill into anything I wasn't supposed to. But if I were doing this on a different wall where that wasn't the case, I probably would have completely covered the back end of these cubbies. But anyway, once I was done building the cubby system, it was then time to stain it. And I used a gel stain for this. I just think gel stains are super rich and they stain so nicely. I ended up making a custom color, but I've linked the 2 colors that I mixed together to create this color in my materials list. I then allowed everything to dry, added about 3 coats of a spray-on polyurethane, allowed that to dry, and eventually it was time to install. Says there's one here. What's the knocking test? Oh, that's definitely a stud. A fun little trick for when you're using the stud finder. It says there's a stud here, so I marked it, but just to double check, You can hear the difference between there being a stud and no stud. If you knock on another part of the wall, it's gonna sound hollow. Right here's hollow. And then here's where the stud is. Sometimes I know what I'm doing. Like I mentioned, it was so important for me to figure out where the studs were in this wall because I didn't want to drill into plumbing and then cause a major issue. So after finding the studs, my brother Jordan helped me to lift the cubbies onto the wall, and then I drilled the cubbies into those studs using some construction screws. I then checked for level like 3,000 times, and once I was happy with how it was looking, it was time to move on to building the cabinet. Friends, sometimes I get really intimidated by the idea of building a cabinet, but then I just remind myself that cabinets are basically just big giant boxes that you stick a piece of wood over to make a door. So with that in mind, I got started by cutting the cabinet pieces to be as deep as the cubby pieces, and then I trimmed them all down to size using my miter saw. In order to simplify this build, I basically ended up just creating one giant 8-foot tall box that I added a support to in the center to separate the big box into two smaller boxes to create two cabinets. I then screwed the bottom and the top of the cabinets directly into the sides with wood screws and added that center support using pocket hole screws and wood glue. I really want this cabinet situation to fit the needs of my parents for a long time, and to do that I added some adjustable shelving holes so that I could add adjustable shelving to both of the cabinets. This way my mom can adjust the shelves based on what she needs to store in there, and she can always put bigger things or smaller things or whatever she needs. And once those adjustable shelf pin holes were drilled, it was time to add the back supports the same exact way that I did for the cubby situation. Again, I left the back of this cabinet open so that I could see exactly where I am drilling the cabinet into. Don't want to hit anything behind that wall. It's like the theme of this entire project. At this point though, I was then able to move on to staining the entire piece because I had already pre-sanded everything and everything already had edge banding as well, and I used the same exact color that I used for those cubbies. Also, gigantic shout out to my brother for helping me with this part of the project because we were able to stain this thing in maybe 15 minutes. And just like those cubbies, I also made sure to apply about 3 coats of spray-on polyurethane before allowing the entire piece to dry and then coming back the next day to fit and cut the cabinet doors. I really wanted to use one solid piece of wood that I cut in half so that the grain pattern would be continuous from the top of the cabinet to the bottom of the cabinet, so that is exactly what I did. I started by cutting a piece of plywood to the exact width of the cabinet, and then I made any trims and any cuts I needed from there using my circular saw and a track. I didn't quite finish the cabinet doors this exact day though, because with custom built-ins you want to fit everything to make sure that it is perfect, so I kind of put them off to the side, and then at this point it was time to install the actual cabinet box into the mudroom itself. Which, spoiler alert, ended up being an adventure and a half because basically I built these cabinets in a way that I could take the top off in order to install the box. However, I forgot to take the top off before we installed the box, and the box did not fit because I built it almost the exact height of the wall. So we took it down, I removed that top portion of the cabinet, we were able to get that cabinet back on up there, and then I had to add the top portion of the cabinet back to the cabinet box using L brackets from the inside. Ooh, I feel like it was more work to explain that than it actually was in real life, but yes, ultimately I was able to figure it out. I was also able to screw the entire cabinet box into studs as well as into those cubbies that I created earlier, and I was able to get that top piece back on. Not gonna lie, was kind of bummed that I couldn't hide those L brackets and that they're kind of just loud and proud on the inside of the cabinet, but once the doors are closed you can't see them anyway, and to be honest it's probably better this way because now if anybody ever needs to take this built-in down, it doesn't need to be destroyed. They can literally just remove those brackets, remove the top piece, and then that entire cabinet can come out in one piece. After attaching the top of that cabinet though, it was time to move on to the floating bench. Luckily, Atlas was there for emotional support because I had to find the studs one more time and make sure that I wasn't drilling into anything I wasn't supposed to before moving on to building the actual frame of the bench. And sorry about the lighting here, I actually started on this entire portion of installing the cabinetry and the bench after my full-time job one night, so it ended up being a late night, but I just wanted to get it done with so I could move on to some other parts of this project. Now let's have a conversation about this floating bench. I actually built this thing pretty much identically to the floating desk that I have on my channel. I will link that below so that you can see it broken down into much more tangible parts. But ultimately what I did was I attached a 2x4 frame to the studs as well as to the cabinet that I built, and I made sure that everything was sturdy and everything was level. Also, because it is above baseboard heating, I did end up installing it about 12 inches above the baseboard to allow for heat to escape in the winter months, and I also took that into account when adding the decorative boards as well, but that will happen in a little bit. After a good night's sleep, I came back the next day and I decided that I wanted to stain the frame of the floating bench that I just made in order to blend it into the boards that I'm going to be attaching later. I stained it a super similar color to the color that I created for the entire built-in, but I actually didn't want to waste that color, so that's why I didn't use the same exact one. I then allowed that to dry, and since I am the ultimate multitasker, decided that while it was drying, I was going to work on some of the more decorative boards that I was using from Common Pine that I bought at Home Depot. And I stained those the same exact color as the Mudroom build-in and then attached them to the frame of the bench using some wood screws. And pretty much the last part of this project was to attach those top boards, which I did using L brackets from the underside of the bench. And I left a pretty substantial gap in between the front and the back board to again allow some of that heat to escape from the baseboard heaters in the winter. But at this point, I was finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and this mudroom build was almost done. I'm just gonna like sit here forever. Oh. The real DIY huntress. It's cabinet door day! Okay, so I actually hate making cabinet doors. They're like the bane of my existence. If you ask me like, Sam, what do you love building? No problem, can give you a laundry list. If you're like, Sam, what do you hate building? No problem, can tell you it's cabinet doors. So the good news is that the cabinet doors for this particular build are literally just plywood. 1, 2. 2 pieces of plywood. Super easy, right? The bad news is, I just realized I ran out of edge banding. I literally only have enough edge banding for one side of the cabinet doors. So I am gonna go to Home Depot and go pick up more edge banding and probably also pick up like 60 other things because I can't control myself when I'm there. I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is, I made it to Home Depot. The bad news is, I just realized I picked up the wrong edge banding. So this is red oak edge banding and this is birch plywood. So I need birch edge banding, not red oak edge banding. But I didn't even realize that I made this mistake until I literally just got back. So off to Home Depot again. All right, friends, good news. April Fools. I know it's definitely not April 1st anymore, but I feel like April Fools is the only thing that's gonna apply here to make me feel better about this. However, I just went to Home Depot, and the reason I picked up the wrong edge banding is because they don't have birch edge banding in stock. So I am going to order edge banding on the Home Depot app. I'm just gonna order it to my local Home Depot. So I probably should have checked this beforehand because it literally is telling me that they might not have it in stock at my local Home Depot. So my bad. All right, perfect. Okay, so they have it in stock at another store that's like slightly farther away, so I'm just gonna order it for store pickup and I'm just gonna go pick it up at one of the lockers instead of guesstimating. Friends, good news. Just got a text my order's ready. It actually was not that long of a wait, so I'm gonna go pick up the edge banding and we're gonna go make some cabinets. Okay. This is so much easier than going through the store. Oh, hi. was easy. Okay, clearly, picking things up from Home Depot lockers, much easier task than filming content for YouTube. Crushing it. Got my edge banding. 3rd time's a charm. I feel like people literally only say that because they don't want you to feel bad about the fact that you've tried the same thing like 2 times and it didn't work out well. For now, so excited to get back to the shed shop to get started and finished on these cabinet doors. But first, I think I'm gonna stop for coffee. See you back at the shop. All right, so once I finally got my hands on the correct edge banding for these doors, I applied the edge banding using my iron, and then I sanded and stained the doors to match the rest of the mudroom build. After staining my doors, I applied 3 coats of polyurethane and allowed them to dry overnight, and then I moved on to attaching the hinges. Now, to attach the hinges, I used a concealed hinge jig as well as some full overlay hinges, but again, I've linked everything I've used below this video as well as on my website if you're looking for more information on how I made this happen. The reason cabinet doors freak me out so much is because even though you've measured a million times and checked for squares, sometimes they just don't fit the way that you want to, but luckily all of my obsessiveness totally paid off because these cabinet doors fit perfectly, and this build was really starting to come together. Even my dad was getting excited about it.
I'm gonna test your bench out.
You're gonna test my bench?
My 200 pounds.
All went well. Feet up. Not gonna lie, I was pretty stoked to see that my dad had given this build the stamp of approval and that that bench could hold up 2 full-grown human beings, because that meant that it was time to kind of focus on finishing touches like adding the shelves, adding the hardware, and then trying to figure out what I wanted to do on that back wall since it was starting to look a little too plain. Quick little tip that I wanted to keep in this video for anybody who might find this helpful. If you're having trouble figuring out where to drill your openings for your hardware, I like to use this trick where I use painter's tape and mark where the hardware needs to go. I then place the painter's tape onto my cabinet doors and measure them out to make sure that they are centered or exactly where I want them to be. And then I use those little openings as my template to drill my holes and then attach all of the hardware. That being said, once the hardware was installed, it was time to move on to that back wall, and I started by taking my mom to Home Depot to pick out some paint samples because she is getting a feature wall. You have a favorite?
I do.
I also have a favorite, but this is your house, so your favorite has to matter the most. Okay. I think I know which one your favorite is, but...
Yes, because you know my tone.
Okay, ready?
Go for it.
1, 2, 3. I know which one you're gonna pick. I know which one you're gonna pick. I thought you were gonna pick this one! Well, thank you for making my job easy. Okay, accent wall work starts tomorrow. The amount of hype that my mom and I got to pick the same color is next level. Honestly, it's like the little things in life. So originally the plan was to maybe keep this back wall plain, but then the more I looked at it, the more I didn't love it and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then I started to feel super inspired by my friends over at Urban Wall Design. They make these amazing geometric feature accent walls. They've also been featured on HGTV. They are just absolutely incredible, and they 100% inspired me to create my own feature wall on this back wall of the mudroom build. So to get started on this part of the project, I first painted that back wall using that color that my mom and I both love so much, and then I began to cut some of the pieces for this accent wall using my miter saw and some pre-primed 1x2 pieces. I started with all of the border pieces, which I also painted before I installed because I didn't want to get paint on any of the mudroom build later, and I attached them to the wall using brad nails. From here on out, I then added some accent pieces using only 45-degree and 90-degree cuts, and I know this should have been planned out before I did this, but I just decided to go with the flow and see what kind of design would come to mind. If you are looking for inspiration for how to plan out something like this, I've done a headboard that's pretty similar and I walk through my design process there. I've linked that video below this video so that you can check it out if you're interested. But once I was happy with the design, I then filled in any of the nail holes and seams using some joint compound. I wiped away any of the excess and sanded away some more later once it had dried. I also added some caulking to hide any of the major gaps and seams in between the boards and the walls. Last step after that was to just go ahead and paint the entire wall the same color to blend everything in. After giving that back wall some time to dry, it was time to move on to some finishing touches in this back room, starting with adding some coats to the back wall of the mudroom built-in. Since I made a super minimal desk area for my dad's work from home space, I really wanted to give him some more storage options, so I ordered this really awesome metal and wood shelf from Home Depot's website that I put together on that back wall next to the sliding barn door. I feel like this is going to give him some really awesome options for storing some of his office stuff, like his printer or some paperwork, and it also gives me another place to put his shrine back in the room, aka his signed Saints helmet, because pretty much the only thing that he's concerned about is that there is a spot for that thing in his office. So, Dad, I gotcha. Another thing that I did end up last minute deciding I wanted to change out was the ceiling fan in this room. Not that there's anything wrong with this fan, I think it's awesome, but because I modernized a lot of the furniture in this back room, I did want to add a more modern ceiling fan back here, and I ended up finding one at Home Depot for like $50 that actually fit perfectly. So I swapped out the old fan and put in the new fan, and it looks really awesome. It is actually pretty amazing what swapping out a light fixture can do for a room. With the fan being replaced, at this point, the only type of major work I actually had to do was replacing and fixing any of the baseboard and the moldings, and then also caulking them to make them look seamless. And I also gave them all a fresh coat of bright white paint, which actually makes a huge difference in the space. At this point in the project, all that was left was to decorate the space, and I actually found a couple of really awesome prints from Home Depot's website, but they did come in white frames, and I did not let that be a deal breaker for me. Instead, I removed these prints from those frames, brought those frames out to my workshop, sanded them down, gave them a nice coat of primer as well as flat black paint, and then I brought them back on inside and replaced the artwork, and now they matched the aesthetic in that room perfectly. Another thing I wanted to add to this room was an indoor-outdoor rug because it is going to function as a high-traffic area, and I also made sure to use some rug tape so that the rug does not curl up on the ends when people walk across it. I also added some pillows and some baskets and a really awesome custom art piece for my dad that just makes me laugh every time I walk past it. And the last thing that I had to add to that space was the most important thing for my dad in this entire room, his shrine. I am so blown away by how different this room looks and how well it turned out, and even more importantly, my parents are so stoked about it. My mom actually continually just stares at the mudroom wall and tells me that she can't stop staring at it, so that to me is a really great sign. This room went from being a cluttered home office and catch-all space for my family stuff to being a really well-organized and minimal space that now functions so well, not only for my parents, but also for when guests come over and have to walk through this space to get to the backyard. This room has done a full 180 and completely functions in such a different way now, and I'm so happy that I was able to bring that vision to life for my parents. And I'm so grateful for them for trusting me with this project because this was actually a lot of fun. It can be really hard to juggle a full-time job as well as home projects, but I promise you that if I can do it, literally anybody can do it. In fact, my major goal on the channel this year is to continue to tackle some larger projects like this with amazing partners like the Home Depot to show you how easy it is to still tackle home projects while working. As always, friends, thank you so much for all of your love and your support and for sticking around and watching my projects come to life. I do hope that you will give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. But until next time, friends, happy DIYing.